There is a moment in life that rarely announces itself with noise or drama, a moment so subtle that you may almost overlook it, yet so decisive that once it arrives, something inside you shifts in a way that cannot be undone. It does not resemble anger, nor does it carry the heaviness of sadness. Instead, it feels like a deeper internal threshold has been reached, as if a quiet voice within you has finally decided it can no longer continue carrying what was never truly yours. At first, you may not even be able to describe it clearly. It might come as a strange sensation, a simultaneous feeling of release and collapse, as though something within you has both given up and awakened at the same time. What makes this moment so unusual is that it rarely appears when everything around you is visibly breaking down. In fact, it often comes after you have already done everything in your power to hold things together. After you have been patient beyond reason, after you have explained yourself repeatedly, after you have waited longer than you should have, and convinced yourself that just a little more effort, a little more understanding, or a little more endurance would finally make a difference. But the expected change never arrives. Instead, the shift happens somewhere else, not in the external world, but within you. Carl Jung suggested that when the psyche refuses to continue along a certain path, it is not a random failure or a sign of weakness. It is a signal, a demand for transformation coming from the unconscious. This is where individuation begins, the process in which the false structures of identity start to dissolve, allowing something more authentic to emerge. Yet this process rarely feels graceful or empowering in the beginning. It often feels like loss, like disorientation, like standing in a place where certainty has disappeared. The only thing you know for sure is that you cannot return to the version of yourself that once accepted everything as it was. What complicates this experience further is the absence of validation. No one steps in to confirm that your feelings are justified. No one reassures you that what you're sensing is real. In fact, for a long time, you may have been telling yourself the opposite. You may have believed that you were overthinking, that you were too sensitive, that what you were experiencing was simply part of reality. Gradually, without realizing it, you adapt to what is actually draining you. You begin to normalize situations that quietly diminish you. You remain in environments that exhaust your energy. You stay connected to people who take more than they give. You suppress parts of yourself just to maintain something that never fully supports you. Over time, this becomes your normal, not because it is natural, but because it is familiar. And familiarity exerts a powerful influence on the human mind. Jung observed that the psyche tends to prefer what is known over what is true, even when what is known brings discomfort or pain. The unknown, by contrast, demands transformation, and transformation requires letting go. At its deepest level, letting go can feel like a form of death, not a physical one, but the death of an identity that was built around survival rather than authenticity. This is why saying no more is so difficult, because you're not simply stepping away from a situation or a relationship. You're separating from a version of yourself that has existed for years, a version that learned how to tolerate discomfort, how to adjust to circumstances, how to make sense of what never truly made sense. A version that found a strange comfort in discomfort, simply because it did not know there was another way to exist. Yet, beneath all of this, the psyche remains aware. Even when ignored, even when silenced, it continues to communicate. It speaks through recurring discomfort, through patterns that repeat themselves in different forms, through an underlying sense that something is not right even when everything appears stable on the surface. It shows up as unexplained anxiety, as relationships that feel strangely familiar yet deeply unsatisfying, as moments of quiet unease that you cannot fully explain. This is where the concept of the shadow becomes essential. The shadow represents the parts of yourself that have been pushed out of awareness, not because they are insignificant, but because they were once deemed unacceptable. These can include emotions you were taught to suppress, needs you were told were excessive, or desires that did not align with who you were expected to be. None of these aspects disappear. Instead, they move into the unconscious, waiting for the opportunity to be acknowledged. When you finally reach the point of saying no more, you're not only making a decision in your external life, you are also confronting your shadow. You are facing the fears you have avoided, the insecurities you have buried, and the internal conflicts you have tried to silence. The fear of being alone, the fear of inadequacy, the fear of losing something, even if it was harmful to you. These fears do not disappear simply because you choose change. On the contrary, they often become more intense. They rise to the surface and demand your attention. This is why the beginning of transformation often feels chaotic. The unconscious resists change because its primary function is to maintain stability and protect you from perceived danger. In psychological terms, safety often means predictability, even if that predictability involves discomfort. So when you step outside of familiar patterns, your mind reacts. It creates doubt. It questions your decisions. It reminds you of everything you might lose. At this stage, many people turn back, not because they lack strength, but because the discomfort feels like evidence that something is wrong. However, this discomfort is not a warning to stop. It is an indication that something is shifting. It means that the internal structures you have relied on are no longer stable, and the identity you have been living through is no longer aligned with who you are becoming. If you continue moving forward despite this discomfort, something subtle yet profound begins to occur. The energy that was once consumed by maintaining unstable situations starts to return to you. The effort you once invested in trying to fix what could not be fixed, in holding together what was never truly stable, begins to free itself. You also reclaim the energy that was used to suppress your own needs, your own voice, and your own truth. Jung described this stage as a form of psychological rebirth, not because you become an entirely different person, but because you reconnect with aspects of yourself that have always existed beneath the adaptations. This reconnection does not happen suddenly or dramatically. It unfolds gradually, reshaping how you perceive yourself and the world around you. Things that once felt intensely important begin to lose their emotional charge. Situations that once triggered strong reactions start to feel more distant. What once seemed impossible to live without begins to reveal itself as something you had simply grown accustomed to. This shift is not indifference, it is clarity. From this clarity, something begins to emerge that many people spend their entire lives searching for. A form of self-love that is not dependent on external validation. It is not based on how others treat you, how they respond to you, or whether they choose you. Instead, it arises from recognizing your own inherent value, independent of external perception. This kind of self-love does not manifest as constant happiness or excitement. It feels more like a steady sense of peace, a quiet understanding that you no longer need to abandon yourself in order to be accepted, that you no longer need to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for you, that you no longer need to pursue what does not naturally meet you with the same energy. Once you experience this state, even briefly, something irreversible takes place. You cannot unsee it. You cannot return to the same level of tolerance for situations that once felt normal, because now you perceive them differently, not just intellectually, but on a deeper level that reshapes your entire perspective. You begin to notice patterns that you once overlooked, behaviors that you once justified, dynamics that you once accepted without question. And this awareness initiates another stage of transformation, because seeing clearly inevitably leads to acting differently, and acting differently requires boundaries. Boundaries, however, are not only about how you interact with others. They are also about how you relate to yourself. They define the line between who you used to be and who you are becoming. Maintaining that line is not always easy, because it often brings consequences. People around you may not understand your changes. They may question your decisions or react in ways you did not expect. This does not necessarily come from a place of harm, but rather from the disruption of familiar dynamics. When you change, the patterns that once defined your relationships also change, and that can be uncomfortable for others. Some people will adapt and grow alongside you. Others will not. And this is where one of the most challenging realizations emerges. You are not responsible for how others respond to your growth. You are only responsible for whether you remain true to it. And this is where the journey deepens even further. Because once you stop abandoning yourself, something unexpected begins to surface in your life. It is not noise, not chaos, but the opposite. It is silence, not the absence of sound from others, but a quietness within your own internal world. The conversations that once consumed your thoughts begin to fade. The emotional highs and lows that once defined your days start to level out. The patterns that kept you constantly engaged, constantly reacting, begin to dissolve. And in their place, there is space. At first, that space can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. It may resemble emptiness, as though something important is missing. But what you're actually experiencing is the absence of distraction. For a long time, your identity may have been tied to what you were trying to fix, maintain, or understand. And without those constant demands, you're left with something that feels unknown. You're left with yourself. Not the version shaped by expectations or adjusted for others, but the version that exists beneath all of that. Encountering this version of yourself is not always easy. It can feel uncertain, even unsettling. Jung believed that the fear of this inner emptiness is one of the greatest obstacles in psychological development. The mind instinctively wants to fill the void as quickly as possible. It seeks something new, something familiar, something that restores a sense of certainty. But when you rush to fill that space, you interrupt the transformation that is trying to take place. You return to patterns before fully understanding them. You recreate dynamics before truly outgrowing them. This is why the space you feel is not something to escape, but something to enter consciously, to remain with, to observe without immediately trying to change it. Because within that stillness, clarity begins to take shape. Not all at once, not as a sudden realization, but gradually through quiet insights that begin to shift your understanding. You start to recognize what you truly need, not from fear or habit, but from awareness. You begin to distinguish what aligns with you and what does not, without relying on external confirmation. As this clarity strengthens, your perception of other people begins to change as well. You no longer view them through the lens of who they could become or who you hope they might be. Instead, you begin to see them as they are in the present moment. Not their potential, not their promises, but their reality. This shift can feel both liberating and painful at the same time, because it removes the illusion that effort alone can transform someone. It reveals a truth that is simple, yet often difficult to accept. You cannot change someone who is unwilling to change themselves. There may have been a time when you believed that giving more, understanding more, or waiting longer would eventually lead to a different outcome, that your patience and empathy would be recognized and returned. But now your perspective evolves. You begin to understand that connection cannot grow in a space where responsibility is avoided. That no matter how much you offer, it cannot compensate for what another person is not willing to face within themselves. This is where Jung's concept of projection becomes visible in a very real way. When individuals avoid confronting their own inner conflicts, they often project those unresolved elements onto others. They transfer their confusion, their fears, and their internal struggles outward. And if you were once in the position of receiving that projection, it may have led you to believe that you were the source of the problem, that you were too much, too sensitive, or too demanding. But in truth, you were often reflecting something they were not ready to acknowledge within themselves. When you step out of that dynamic, when you decide that you will no longer participate in it, something shifts not only within you, but also in the dynamic itself. The patterns that once allowed avoidance can no longer function in the same way, and this disruption can trigger reactions. People may question your behavior. They may attempt to draw you back into familiar patterns. They may interpret your boundaries as distance, your clarity as indifference, or your self-respect as rejection. But what is actually happening is much deeper than it appears. You're no longer reinforcing the illusion that kept the dynamic stable. You are no longer playing a role that allowed both sides to remain unchanged. And because of that, the system is forced to respond. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something different. This is often the point where doubt returns, not as a clear decision, but as a subtle pull. The mind begins to revisit the past, highlighting the moments that felt good, softening the ones that were difficult, and constructing a narrative that makes returning seem easier than continuing forward. But this is not clarity. It is habit, attempting to restore itself. Missing something does not necessarily mean that it is right for you. Questioning your decision does not mean that it was a mistake. These responses are natural. They are part of the mind adjusting to a new reality, one where familiarity no longer defines your choices. If you allow these feelings to exist without immediately acting on them, something remarkable begins to happen. A sense of stability starts to form within you, not because everything around you becomes perfect, but because your sense of self is no longer dependent on external conditions. You're no longer reacting to every shift in your environment. Instead, you are grounded within yourself. This internal grounding changes how you experience everything. Situations that once triggered intense reactions begin to lose their power. Interactions that once felt confusing start to become clear. You begin to recognize patterns more quickly, not with judgment, but with understanding. And from that understanding, you begin to make different choices, not out of fear, but out of alignment with who you have become. Jung spoke about synchronicity as the meaningful connection between internal states and external events. While this idea may seem abstract, it becomes tangible during this stage of transformation. When you're no longer acting from unconscious patterns, your external experiences begin to reflect your internal clarity. It is not that you are attracting something entirely new, but that you are allowing what already aligns with you to become visible. People who resonate with your energy begin to appear without force or effort. Opportunities that once felt distant begin to feel accessible, not because the world has suddenly changed, but because your way of engaging with it has transformed. You are no longer operating from a sense of lack, trying to fill something missing. You're acting from a sense of wholeness, and that shift changes everything. Yet even here, there is one final challenge. It is not dramatic or obvious, but it is essential. It is the test of consistency, because transformation is not defined by moments of clarity, but by moments of temptation. Life will present you with familiar situations again. People from your past may reappear. Old patterns may resurface, sometimes in new forms. In those moments, you're faced with a choice, not a loud or visible choice, but a quiet internal one. Do you respond as the person you used to be, or as the person you have become? Do you return to what is familiar, or do you remain aligned with what you now know to be true? This is where awareness becomes your greatest strength, because now you can recognize what is being asked of you. You can sense when something requires you to compromise your peace. You can feel when a situation invites you to shrink yourself again, and instead of negotiating with it or trying to make it work, you simply choose differently. You no longer feel the need to explain every decision. You no longer feel obligated to justify your boundaries. You no longer seek to convince others of your value, because your value is no longer something you are trying to prove. It is something you embody. And when you reach this point, something quiet yet powerful settles within you. It is a sense of certainty that does not depend on validation, a sense of calm that does not rely on outcomes, a sense of identity that is no longer shaped by fear or external approval. You are no longer waiting to be chosen. You are no longer measuring your worth through someone else's attention or behavior. You are no longer trying to become enough for someone who cannot see you clearly. Instead, you have entered a different kind of relationship with yourself. From this place, life begins to feel different, not necessarily easier or without challenges, but more aligned. You develop a natural sense of what to invest your energy in and what to release. You recognize which connections support your growth and which ones hold you back. You no longer chase clarity because you can feel it when it is present. Perhaps the most important shift is this. You stop searching outside for what has always existed within you. The validation, the sense of belonging, the feeling of being enough. You begin to understand that these were never things that others could give you in a lasting way. They were reflections of something you had not yet fully acknowledged within yourself. This is the essence of self-love, not as an idea or a temporary emotion, but as an ongoing relationship. A relationship grounded in trust. Trust in your perception, trust in your decisions, trust in your ability to walk away from what does not align and move toward what does. Once that trust is established, everything changes in a subtle but undeniable way. You no longer hesitate in the same way you once did. You no longer question yourself at every step. You move forward with a quiet confidence, not because you are certain about every outcome, but because you are certain about who you are. At that point, the desire to return to the past begins to fade, not because the past was entirely negative, but because you have outgrown it. You can see it clearly for what it was, a necessary part of your journey, but not a place you're meant to remain. You understand that going back would not bring you peace. It would only distance you from the person you have become. So if you find yourself in this space somewhere between what used to be and what is beginning to unfold, understand this clearly. You are not lost. You are in the middle of transformation. You are not empty. You are creating space for something more aligned. You are not alone. You are, perhaps for the first time, fully with yourself. And that is where everything truly begins.